Back in August of 1936, the Spanish Civil War was just getting started. For the Nationalist forces coming up from the south, the strategy seemed simple, at least on paper: a lightning-fast strike to take Madrid and end the war quickly. But the campaign that unfolded, ending in the incredibly brutal fight for Badajoz, didn't just challenge that strategy, it completely broke it. It changed the entire course of the war. So, let's dive into the military analysis of what happened.
Now, everything we're going to discuss today is based on one specific source: the incredibly detailed operational history put together by Colonel F.J. Victor Rodrigo. We're sticking strictly to his research because it allows us to look at these events with a clear academic focus, just as they happened on the ground, without getting lost in later narratives.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the order that kicked off the race to Madrid. Then, we'll track the initial advance as it moved out from Seville. After that, we'll focus on Mérida, a really key objective. Then comes the main event, the assault on Badajoz. And finally, we'll unpack the massive change in strategy that came out of it all.
So at the very beginning of this campaign, everything, and I mean everything, was about one thing. For General Franco, the only priority was getting to Madrid and getting there fast. That sense of extreme urgency was the bedrock of this whole operation.
And here you can see it, the actual order, signed on August 1st. That set the whole thing in motion. It tells the columns under Asensio and Castellan to head north from Seville, with Madrid as the ultimate prize. But you know, this wasn't just a plan, it was a huge gamble. It was based entirely on one single assumption, that the enemy was disorganized and wouldn't be able to put up a real fight. The goal was what they called a guerra relámpago, a lightning war.
This idea of a lightning war was absolutely central to their whole way of thinking. The Nationalist command was completely convinced that their professional troops would just shatter the morale of the Republican militias. They expected defenses to collapse and towns to fall one after another. And for a little while, every easy victory seemed to prove them right, building this really dangerous sense of unstoppable momentum.
And so they were off. In those first few days, the plan looked like a stroke of genius. It was a textbook example of that lightning war concept working perfectly, all defined by just incredible speed.
Just look at this map. It really tells the story. Asensio's motorized column leaves Seville on August 2nd, and their progress is just stunning. Yeah, they hit some blown bridges and ran into a few small ambushes, but those were just minor headaches. By August 5th, they'd taken Fuente de Cantos with barely a fight. From the perspective of the Nationalist command, it must have felt like their whole theory of the war was being proven right, hour by hour.
Think about that number for a second. 200 kilometers in just 8 days. It's a pretty stark way to measure the incredible speed they were setting. This really was the lightning war in action. But this easy, almost effortless phase of the advance was about to slam into a very solid brick wall. And that brings us to Mérida. This city would be the first real objective, the first major test for the Nationalist columns. It was an absolutely pivotal moment in this march north. Now, the attack on Mérida on August 11th wasn't just a simple head-on charge. It was actually a pretty smart maneuver. Asensio's troops swung around to the east to envelop the city, while Castellan's column pushed right up the main road, crossing that famous old Roman bridge. Taking the city was a huge strategic win. It gave them a critical road and rail hub, and for the first time it linked them up with other Nationalist forces coming down from the north. But most importantly, it left the city of Badajoz completely cut off and isolated. Which leads us right to the climax of this whole campaign, and really the core of our analysis today, the assault on Badajoz. This battle would become the crucible where the entire initial strategy of the war was not just tested, it was completely melted down and reforged. Badajoz was a seriously tough nut to crack. I mean, just look at it. This was a classic fortress city, surrounded by these old but very thick walls, a castle overlooking everything, and outer forts like Picurniña and Pardileras. Now, the fortifications were ancient, sure, but they were still a massive obstacle, especially for an attacker like Lieutenant Colonel Yagüe, who was working with very limited artillery and air power. The assault on August 14th was just savage. It came in two main thrusts. Down in the south, Castellan's V Bandera broke through the Puerta del Pilar around 10:30 in the morning and got into the city. But the main attack, over on the east at the Puerta de la Trinidad, was an absolute slaughterhouse. Asensio's IV Bandera of the Legion was thrown at the walls and beaten back again and again. After 3 bloody failed attempts, a fourth wave, led by the incredibly brave Captain Caballero, finally punched through at 3:30 in the afternoon. And get this, only 16 of his men made it through that initial breach. Just 16. And this quote here and just perfectly captures what came next. It says, "The fighting continued in the streets until nightfall." This is such a critical point. Getting through the walls wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning of hours and hours of vicious hand-to-hand fighting through the city's tight, winding streets.
The price of this victory was just staggering, especially for the elite attacking troops. The Nationalists took 285 casualties. And you have to remember, these weren't just any soldiers. The losses were concentrated in their very best, most experienced units. The IV Bandera, the one that led that hellish assault on the Puerta de la Trinidad, lost 106 men by itself. These were men they simply could not replace, and it was a blow that their small expeditionary army could not afford.
And that brings us to the real heart of the matter. The capture of Badajoz was, no doubt, a tactical victory, but strategically, the consequences were seismic. In a strange paradox, this was the victory that put a final, definitive end to their lightning war.
So the question hanging over the Nationalists' high command was blunt. Is the lightning war over? And the ferocity of the defense at Badajoz, along with that horrific butcher's bill, provided an answer that was as brutal as it was clear.
And this map right here, this map is the answer. It shows Franco's new thinking right after Badajoz, laid out in a message to General Mola. The whole idea of a single, mad dash for Madrid, it's gone. What you see instead is a much slower, more careful, phase-by-phase advance. First to Oropesa, then to Talavera, then to Mérida. The bold sprint had been replaced by a cautious, grinding march.
The lesson they learned is probably best summed up by Franco himself in his own words. Today, a well-defended town can halt in advance. That was the bloody lesson of Badajoz. That early optimistic belief that the enemy would just crumble and run was shattered. One single city had proven that it could stop his best troops dead in their tracks and make them pay a terrible price for every inch.
So the final consequence was crystal clear. As the source material puts it so powerfully, the primitive criteria of a swift war was shattered. The dream of a fast, decisive victory in 1936 died right there in the streets of Badajoz. A new, much slower and much more brutal war of attrition was now the only path forward.
And that leaves us with one last, really provocative question to think about. Should we remember the Battle of Badajoz not just as a bloody victory, but as the moment that, ironically, guaranteed that the Spanish Civil War would be a long, grinding, and truly devastating conflict? A victory that ultimately denied the victors the one thing they wanted most, a quick end to it all.